Hey guys, I'm Simon, and this is my first ever in-depth keyboard review on YouTube. Now, what we got here is the Singa 75. Now, this is made by Elaine, or Singa KBD, and this is a pre-production model that predates all of the public runs done at a later time. So this was Elaine's very first keyboard, and although I'm not a big fan of 75. I had jumped onto this private buy just to support Elaine. Before we get into the very in-depth version of this review, I very much like this keyboard. I think it's a great keyboard. I think it is a pretty solid value proposition even now in 2020. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the outer case. We're going to review the anodization. We're going to comment on the design styling and the general stylistic choices. We're going to cover a whole bunch of stuff. So first thing we want to do is take a look at the general design aesthetics. Now, this is a wing keyless 75% layout without a separated function row. A lot of people find that a little bit annoying, but considering this keyboard is from 2018 or designed in 2018, the general design aesthetic for a separate function row had not yet become, such a common thing. So we have to be true to the time period in which this keyboard was released. In general, this follows a very Korean design aesthetic. We can tell this by these type of sides. What looks like an 8-degree angle, which is fairly normal for Korean boards that are not duck boards. What I have here is a two-tone variant, though the anodization matching is generally very good from Elaine. This is a top-mount keyboard. It's got a little fillet here on the back side, just to flatten it out a little bit as soon as you get to this portion of the keyboard right here. The bump-ons are fairly standard, and my case is missing 4 screws, which, to be fair, it was Elaine's very first time fulfilling any sort of big buy, so she's not going to lose any points for that. Let's get really close and personal now. A very noticeable thing is the light fillet here around the edges. Now, this fillet exists on all sides of the keyboard, but is quite cool. The downside to something like this is, as you can see here, the finishing procedure, so the hand polishing and the anodization that's done on these little fillets tends to be much harder to do without any flaws. And that's just a general design aesthetic. In terms of the machining is quite clean. Here we can see that there's a tiny little bump up before we hit the side profile. And if we focus on the side, we can see that the machining here is also quite good. Keep in mind, this is a rather old keyboard, so there might be some little nicks and scratches that are a result of me just using the board heavily. In terms of the tolerances between the top and bottom here, on camera it basically looks like one piece. There's no noticeable gap. The machining is done very, very cleanly. You can see a little bit of grittiness here, but that's fairly normal. You can never have a perfectly flat seam due to the finishing and anodization process. Something similar can be seen on my keyboard, for example, or one of my keyboards. Like even here, you can tell that the seams are not absolutely perfect. One very big selling point of the Singa was this very interesting weight. Now, On the pre-production and the first round models, I believe the weight was brass and it was sandblasted. Now, I've gone ahead and polished mine, obviously not perfectly, but it is quite a shiny little polished job there. Subsequent runs actually used stainless steel weights that are significantly more expensive to machine, but overall lead to a higher likelihood of good quality finishing and good quality machining. Now, in terms of the edges, this looks to be about 8 millimeters and this looks to be about 5 millimeters, and that's pretty much the Korean standard. And going forward, we'll notice that a lot of things are the Korean standard in terms of design aesthetics. These little internal radiuses here are very, very close to old school Korean ones. And the angle at which these cuts or these blockers come in is very similar to an OTD styling where, let's see if I can get a little bit closer. You can tell this is a very sharp point, and that tends to be more of a Korean stylistic thing. Now, traditionally, more Western keyboards will have slightly rounder edges here, and the blocker will not protrude as far as it does here. What we're going to do now is we're going to do a quick little disassembly of the board in order to get into the internal components. All right. Now, before moving any further, one noticeable issue that I have with this board is the fact that there are no internal alignment pillars to align the bottom case to the top case. This means that it's entirely possible to offset it during installation, which as a result means it's possible that you could get a slight overlap like this, or the other way around, and that's a little annoying. Now, this keyboard was designed in 2018. However, keep in mind, keyboards designed as early as 2014, 2015, like OTDs, had internal alignment pillars. Now, the issue with alignment pillars is when you've got very, very small bezels around the side, the only real way to do it is by physical pillars here, and that's quite hard to machine. It is still technically feasible, and I would have much preferred the keyboard if it had internal alignment pillars. We can see here that the case bottom actually has two weights. The external weight is screwed in by these two screws, and the internal weight is held in by what should be 4 screws, but for some reason we're missing yet another screw here. There's some nice internal machining done here. I like that. Now, more modern boards obviously tend to engrave the brass, but I'm a big fan of direct engraving on straight aluminum. If we look at the case bottom, we can see that the entirety of the angle is generated by the case bottom, which then means that the case top is perfectly flat, as seen here. This is fairly normal. A lot of keyboards will do this as long as they are of a seamed design. Seamless keyboards obviously tend to be different. They tend to have a flatter bottom, and the curvature is handled by the top piece. Here on the case bottom, we can see a big old cutout for the USB, which I would have preferred to be USB-C, but considering the year that this was released, camera's going on the fritz. Considering the year that this was released, USB-B Mini was pretty much the norm. A big issue I do have is that the port is actually recessed quite a bit into the case. As a result, this means if you've got a big bulky connector, you basically won't be able to use it as it will not fit in the hole. What you'll need essentially is a very, very basic connector, such as this one. And that's a little aggravating. Now, generally nowadays, this is something that's solved with using a daughter board, but alternatively, some keyboards like the Orange 80, also known as the Pizza 80, had a little bit of an extended PCB area so that the port could sit absolutely flush. All right, let's get the plate out of here. All right. Now, in terms of the plate, this is a very stereotypical 2017-2018 design. This was before fixed plates were much more common. So we've got a big ol' ISO cutout, which generally leads to your backslash key being slightly crooked, though in this case, the plate handles switches incredibly well. The bottom row is wide open as to offer as much compatibility, which is quite important, but now is handled a little bit differently. If we look at the mounting points, we can see that there are 8 total mounting points that top mount this plate into the top case. We can see here that the spacebar mounting areas are not centered on the 7U spacebar and actually sit on the inside of the stabilizer area. Now, with more flexible or more old school plates, these tended to be put a little bit further out or simply not at all. So, for example, you'd have one here, maybe one here. This was in order to maximize the amount of noticeable flex when you were to press down hard on the spacebar. Now, all the issues aside, actually, we'll get into one quick issue. The plate that is being offered, or was offered, and I believe is still being offered on the most recent run, is a sandblasted brass plate. Now, the sandblast is very, very well done, although brass will tarnish, and brass does tarnish, especially in very humid environments. Where I live is incredibly humid, and this keyboard got almost no use, but you can very clearly see a whole bunch of little black spots everywhere. It's most noticeable here as it's a big open area, and that's simply just from existing. If you look very closely, you can see a lot of black spots in there as well, in there. Now, I've already gone ahead and cleaned this plate, so this is all actual tarnish. I also don't like the option of the brass plate by default. Now, the brass plate is a lot more noob friendly and tends to sound better for the Western market. It deepens the sound of bottom outs, though given the design choices of this keyboard, which are very Korean oriented, this was the better choice for the vast majority of customers. So in general, the Singa 75 sounds higher pitch and quieter, which is the more stereotypical Korean sounding keyboard sound. While throwing a brass plate into the mix essentially makes it sound a little bit lower pitch and kind of helps bring up the loudness a tiny little bit, which is preferred by the vast majority of the Western market. I would have personally preferred something along the lines of an aluminum plate. Now, aluminum sits kind of in between, where it offers a little bit of a softer bottom out, a little bit more flex than brass, and as a result feels a little bit better, but in terms of sound will raise the pitch. Now that covers the case as well as the plate. We'll take a look at the PCB. Now, PCB technology has come quite a ways. Obviously, this is a variable layout, so you've got a lot of bottom row options, of which you can use one. It's got the ISO support. In general, though, the PCB is incredibly well done. This does use PS2AV, which is boot mapper client, which is kind of sad, and I obviously expect more recent runs to have QMK support, and as a result, VIA support. It's a little aggravating. Of course, it comes with the age that this would be a boot mapper client PCB and would have a mini B. The issue with mini B tends to be with very old custom cables. The connector here will get a little loose, and as it gets loose, if you move your keyboard around the desk, your keyboard will actually disconnect, which is incredibly infuriating if you're typing. In terms of compatibility of the PCB is good, allows for, I think, every flavor of 75 I know about. The plate is wide open in a lot of areas, especially in the bottom row, which is a little bit sad, but the thing I was going to mention earlier was that the tolerances for the switch cutouts are incredibly tight, which is a really good thing. This means that you can effectively use plate mount switches, and the plate will correctly align the switches for you. It's the case with a lot of keyboard plates, especially softer, more flexible plates, that even though you've firmly put the switch into the plate, it can still be crooked. Whereas this is an incredibly tight plate. A lot of users had complaints about this, about switches being far too difficult to push into the plate. And yes, I remember building this and it was incredibly painful, though I don't see this as a bad thing at all. I would rather suffer for, 30 minutes and have perfectly straight switches than to do the build and then realize I need to rebuild the entire thing because every single switch is crooked. So the plate is great, even given all of the layout options it allows. We'll do a quick little run through. Look at the anodization. Now, in general, it is quite clean. The edges may look a little rough on camera, but keep in mind, we're zoomed in quite a bit here. There are some marks in between the top and bottom piece, which is to be fully expected. If you look, you can see some discoloration here and here. That's obviously the hook marks from the anodization process, where they hook in the pieces of aluminum to be dipped into the acid bath. It's very clean. This particular shade of purple was only available on the private run. It was changed to a darker purple. So this is actually quite violet. Sorry, not violet. It's actually creamy. It's very creamy. It's a very, very light purple instead of a more blue-rich dark purple. Overall, very nice. And the case bottom is quite nice as well. Obviously here we can see some little marks from the hooks, but again, that's to be expected. Overall, I think the anodization quality was very good. I've heard from a few users that their top and bottom piece matching was not the best, but realistically, it's incredibly hard to ano match with a seamed case. It is incredibly difficult, even with expertly matched anos. They may look unmatched depending on lighting, as the two pieces will never reflect light in exactly the same way. So although under a perfectly smooth light they may look identical, depending on the lighting conditions it can look different. All right, now I talked about how this keyboard is very Korean sounding, and what we'll do is we'll hop into a sound test and essentially just run it right through, see how it sounds, and then we'll finish with a quick recap. All right, so overall from the sound profile, we can tell that it is more on the Korean tune side, and we can hear the slight differences that the brass plate makes in order to lower the pitch a little bit and make it a little bit more Western sounding and Western tuned. Now, in addition to the brass plate, obviously the full weight of the unit comes into play. Now, this unit built weighs 2,300 grams, or actually 2,230 grams, but we'll call it 2.3 kilos. And for 75%, that is rather hefty. This is due to the external weight as well as the internal brass weight and the brass plate. Not to mention the thickness of the bottom piece that we saw earlier. Now, overall, I think this is a great keyboard given its age, though in 2020, if I were to buy this exact keyboard, I would be missing out on a lot of modern features. I would be missing out on, most importantly, the top and bottom case assembly with alignment pillars. I would be missing out on more flexible plate options. I would be missing out on a more refined PCB and hopefully a flush port, so I don't have to, go around and find a really skinny USB connector to be able to plug my keyboard in. I mean, of course, I mentioned earlier, I'm not a big fan of 75, so in general, I never really got much use out of it. I think that the attached function row, where the F1 is right above the 1, the F6 is above the 6, leads to more accidental presses in most cases for me, since it's not a generic full size or TKL layout, and that can be kind of rough for people. In terms of the value proposition, now this comes in at under $400, and for the price, it is excellent. For the price, the level of quality control, the fullness and the smoothness of the anodization is great. Obviously, I have my issues with it, which is why it is being sold to a friend of mine. Though I am going to miss it, even though I never use it. It was filling up that slot right there in the cabinet. And now it's going to go to its new puppy. If I had to give this keyboard a number rating, I give it this many. And then I strongly suggest that if you enjoy a nice classic, more Korean sounding, not too Korean sounding, but a little Korean sounding 75%, I think the Singa is a solid keyboard and a good buying decision. One last thing, completely forgot about this, but since this is my first ever keyboard review, and assuming you got this far, if you really like this, drop a like. If you want me to do more keyboard reviews in the future, let me know if you want me to go more in depth or less in depth. Obviously, I was a little bit all over the place. This was my first time running through a keyboard, though starting to get an idea of, a good way to break it all up. So let me know if you liked the video. Let me know if you hated the video. Let me know anything. Thank you so much for giving me a watch.